David heard the shuffle of boots before he saw them. The two officers, one short and stocky, the other tall with a cold sneer, were already approaching. "Hey, buddy," the shorter cop said, his name badge reading Myers. "Let's see some ID." David turned, the coffee still steaming in his hand. He met their gazes evenly, his deep brown eyes calm but unreadable. "Any reason?" The taller officer, Donovan, smirked. "You fit the description." David frowned. "Of what?" Myers stepped closer, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. "We got a report about a suspicious individual loitering around here. You match the description. ID now." David clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay composed. He had dealt with this before, too many times. He set his coffee down, slowly reaching for his wallet. "That's funny," he said, pulling out his driver's license. "I've been in here for 2 minutes, buying coffee. That make me a suspect now?" Donovan snatched the ID, barely glancing at it, before shoving it into his pocket. "Step outside." David took a deep breath. The air inside the store had thickened, the cashier behind the counter shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. He had 2 options: comply and hope these officers didn't push things further, or stand his ground. He never got to choose. Myers grabbed his wrist. "I said, step outside." David instinctively pulled back, and in an instant, the situation exploded. Donovan shoved him hard, sending him stumbling against the snack shelf. Before he could regain his balance, Myers swung. The first blow struck his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. "Hands behind your back!" Myers barked. David, trained for combat, reacted on instinct. He dodged the second strike, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm not resisting." A baton crashed against the side of his knee, sending him collapsing onto the tiled floor. The store clerk gasped. A teenage girl near the refrigerated section fumbled for her phone. "Hey!" she yelled, her camera shaking. "He's a veteran. What the hell are you doing?" Donovan turned, his face contorted with rage. "Put that damn phone away, kid." She didn't. The girl kept recording, stepping backward as Myers loomed toward her. "This is police brutality," she shouted. David, coughing, blood pooling in his mouth from a split lip, tried to speak. "I'm a former SEAL. Call my—" A knee pressed into his neck, cutting off his words. The world darkened. Somewhere in the back of his mind, David felt himself being lifted, his body thrown against the hard plastic seat of a patrol car. The cold metal cuffs cut into his wrists. The taste of copper filled his mouth. Through half-lidded eyes, he caught a glimpse of the girl outside. She was still recording, tears running down her face as another officer held her back. Then, everything blurred. The red and blue lights flashed against the rain-soaked pavement. And David Williams, a man who had once risked his life for his country, was driven away like a common criminal. But what neither Myers nor Donovan knew, what none of them knew, was that they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The Pentagon was watching. David's consciousness flickered between reality and darkness. The rough texture of the patrol car's seat pressed against his bruised back as the rain outside painted blurred streaks against the window. His wrists burned where the metal cuffs bit into his skin. He had been in worse situations, combat zones, ambushes, places where death loomed over every breath. But this was different. This was supposed to be home. The squad car screeched to a halt outside the Atlanta Police Department's precinct. The door was yanked open, and a rough hand pulled him out. "Move it," Donovan sneered, shoving David forward. He stumbled but caught himself, his SEAL instincts keeping him balanced. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as officers barely looked up from their paperwork. Just another arrest. Just another man shoved into the system. But David Williams wasn't just another man. They threw him into a cold, dimly lit holding cell. The scent of sweat, urine, and desperation clung to the air. Two other men sat on opposite benches, one older, with a face lined with years of hardship, and another barely past his teenage years, his hood pulled up, as if trying to disappear. David exhaled sharply and leaned back against the wall, feeling the sting of his bruises. His ribs ached from the baton strike. "You good, man?" the older guy asked, his voice rough like sandpaper. David gave a slow nod. "I'll live." "Don't count on it," the teenager muttered. "Cops in this place don't play fair. You piss off the wrong one, you might not walk out." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew the truth in those words. And the worst part? He wasn't even supposed to be here. Outside the holding cell, Officer Lisa Brooks hesitated in front of the booking station. She had been with the force for only 6 months, fresh out of the academy, still idealistic enough to believe in justice. But something about this arrest didn't sit right. She glanced at the paperwork Myers had filed. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, suspected drug possession, all fabricated. She knew Myers, knew how he operated. He had a reputation for tuning up suspects, especially those he didn't think belonged in certain parts of town. Lisa tapped her fingers against the desk, debating whether to say something. Then her eyes landed on the name, David Williams. A flicker of recognition stirred in the back of her mind. Where had she seen that name before? Her heart pounded as she opened the police database and ran a search. The screen blinked. Then, the information appeared. Her breath caught. David James Williams, former U.S. Navy SEAL. 2 Silver Stars, multiple combat deployments, specialist in counterterrorism, former classified operative. Lisa's stomach twisted. They hadn't just arrested anyone. They had arrested one of the most highly trained operatives in the country. And the worst part? If she had found this information, someone else would too. Inside the interrogation room, a steel door groaned as it swung open. Myers and Donovan entered, their eyes gleaming with the arrogance of men who thought they had the power. David sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched them with the patience of a predator assessing its prey. "Here's how this is gonna work," Myers said, tossing a folder onto the table. "You confess to resisting arrest. Maybe we cut you a deal." David raised an eyebrow. "A deal?" Donovan smirked. "We say you got rowdy. We say you swung first. But if you play nice, we don't push for the max sentence." David let out a slow, amused breath. "And if I don't?" Myers leaned in, his breath reeking of cheap coffee. "Then you disappear into the system. No one will hear from you again." David's expression didn't change. Instead, he spoke in a low, even tone. "Stiha, I've been in places where men like you wouldn't last a day. I've fought battles you couldn't even comprehend. You think a couple of dirty cops scare me?" Myers' jaw tightened. "You think your military past means a damn thing in here?" Donovan scoffed. "You're just another black man who thought he could mouth off to a cop." The words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, David smiled. And it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down a man's spine. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." While Myers and Donovan left the room, believing they had won, Lisa Brooks stood in the hallway, heart pounding. She had seen the way David looked at them. He wasn't just a veteran. He was something more. She needed to make a choice. Do nothing and let an innocent man be destroyed, or take a risk and expose the truth. Her hands trembled as she made her decision. She turned back toward her desk, opening a secure military database only accessible to law enforcement. If her gut was right, David Williams wasn't just some former soldier. He was a man with connections, and if those connections found out what had just happened, Atlanta PD was about to have a serious problem. 3 hours later, inside the Pentagon, a classified report landed on the desk of General Thomas Caldwell. The email contained a video attachment, a grainy, shaky recording, a teenage girl's voice shouting, the sound of fists landing, the words, "He's a veteran," ringing through the chaos. Caldwell clicked play, and what he saw made his blood run cold. "Get the Secretary of Defense," he barked. "Right now." The Pentagon had just taken notice, and when the Pentagon takes notice, things start falling apart. General Thomas Caldwell was not a man who startled easily. 30 years in military intelligence had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to analyze information with precision before making a move. But as he replayed the shaky cell phone footage on his secured government-issued laptop, a rare thing happened. His hands clenched into fists. On the screen, David Williams, a decorated SEAL, lay bloodied on the pavement of an Atlanta gas station, struggling to breathe as 2 officers pinned him down. A teenage girl's voice trembled as she cried out, "He's a veteran." "Please, he's not resisting." Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct. This was something bigger. And if a man like David Williams was being thrown into a cell without due process, something was very, very wrong. Caldwell reached for his phone and dialed a direct private line. A few seconds later, Secretary of Defense Robert Langston answered. "Tom, it's late." "What is it?" Caldwell exhaled. "We've got a situation. A former SEAL, highly decorated, was just arrested in Atlanta, under false pretenses." Langston sighed. "We don't interfere with domestic law enforcement. You know that." "This isn't just about one man getting roughed up," Caldwell countered. "It's about what he knows. David Williams isn't some random veteran. He was deep in counterterrorism. He worked on classified operations. If someone as high profile as him can get locked up with fabricated charges, we have a serious security issue." There was a pause on the line. Then, Langston's tone sharpened. "How bad is it?" Caldwell tapped his keyboard, sending over the video file. "Watch it yourself. And know this. If David Williams gets buried in the system, people will start asking questions. Questions we might not be able to answer." Another long silence. Then, "Leave it with me," Langston said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I'll take care of it." Within the hour, a classified memo was sent from the Pentagon to the director of the FBI, marked URGEN2. In it, the message was clear. David Williams is not a normal detainee. This case could have national security implications. Immediate federal intervention required. FBI Special Agent Mike Harrison read the memo twice, his jaw tightening. A veteran being framed was bad enough, but if the Pentagon was involved, that meant there were bigger players at work. Harrison grabbed his coat. "Get my team," he ordered his assistant. "We're going to Atlanta." Inside, Atlanta Police Department's main precinct, Lieutenant Ryan Calloway, the precinct commander, was in his office when Detective Marcus Green knocked on his door. Green stepped in, shutting the door behind him. His voice was low. "We have a problem." Calloway barely looked up from his paperwork. "We always do." "No, sir," Green insisted. "A real problem. FBI just called. They want access to one of our detainees." Calloway finally looked up. "Who?" Green handed him a printout. Calloway's eyes skimmed the name. "David Williams." And then, his face paled. "Shit." Green hesitated. "Sir, Is there something I should know? Calloway clenched his jaw. He knew exactly who David Williams was. More importantly, he knew what would happen if the feds and Pentagon got involved. This wasn't about a simple wrongful arrest anymore. This was a ticking time bomb. Tell Myers and Donovan to hold him, Calloway ordered. No visitors, no phone calls, nothing. Green frowned. Sir, that might not be a good. Do it, Calloway snapped. Green sighed, nodded, and left. As soon as the door shut, Calloway grabbed his phone and dialed. We've got a situation, he said into the receiver, and if we don't handle it fast, this entire department is going to burn. David sat on the hard bench, head tilted against the wall. He was exhausted, but his mind was sharp. He had endured enemy interrogations before. This question mark. This was nothing. But he also knew time wasn't on his side. He needed an opening. The door creaked open. Officer Lisa Brooks stepped inside, glancing around nervously before shutting it behind her. David studied her. She looked conflicted. You're Lisa, he said. Not a question, an observation. Her eyes widened. How do you? I read your badge when you processed me. His tone was calm, controlled. You don't belong here, do you? Lisa exhaled. Listen, I don't have much time. I know who you are, David. That piqued his interest. Do you? You're not just a vet, she said. You're a former SEAL. You worked with the Pentagon. You have friends in high places. David remained silent. Lisa hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. A burner phone. She slid it across the table. You get one call. One chance. Use it wisely. David didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. Who is this? David's voice was steady. It's Williams. A pause. Then, Jesus Christ, man. We've been looking for you. Are you safe? Not yet, David murmured. But I will be. Lisa watched, her breath shallow. David's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she realized she had just chosen a side. In Washington, Langston picked up his secure line and called Caldwell. We're moving forward, he said. We're shutting this down. Caldwell leaned back, steepling his fingers. How? Langston's voice was cold, decisive. We cut them off. 30 minutes later, a shocking memo was issued. All federal funding to Atlanta PD is suspended pending an internal review. All federal support, including military surplus and intelligence sharing, is revoked. All Atlanta PD officers with prior complaints are placed under immediate investigation. The news hit like a bomb. At the precinct, officers whispered among themselves. Phones rang off the hook. Reporters were outside. And inside his office, Lieutenant Calloway stared at the memo on his screen. His department was cut off. No funding, no protection, no support. A cold sweat trickled down his spine. They were being dismantled. And at the center of it all, David Williams. At that moment, in his holding cell, David smiled. He knew what was coming. And he was ready. David sat in the dimly lit holding cell, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall. The air was thick with the stale scent of sweat and metal. The room was silent, save for the occasional distant murmur of officers passing outside. He wasn't afraid. He had been in far worse situations, trapped behind enemy lines, held captive in hostile territories, enduring days without food or sleep. This This was nothing but a waiting game. But he knew one thing for sure. They were afraid of him. Not because he was violent, not because he was dangerous, but because of what he knew. And in this game, knowledge was power. Lisa Brooks sat at her desk, pretending to sift through paperwork. She glanced around nervously. No one seemed to be paying her any mind. She had taken a risk, a big one, by slipping David that burner phone. If anyone found out, she would be ruined. But something about this case felt wrong. She had seen officers use force before. Some arrests were aggressive. But this was different. The way Myers and Donovan had beaten David, fabricated the report, and then acted like nothing happened. It made her stomach churn. Lisa knew corruption existed in the system. She had heard the whispers, the warnings, but she never imagined it ran this deep. She opened her laptop, hesitated, then quickly pulled up internal records. David Williams's case wasn't the first, not even close. She scrolled through the database, her eyes widening as she found dozens of cases, black men, many of them veterans, arrested on fabricated charges, denied legal counsel, and often disappeared into the system without a trace. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just about David. This was a pattern. And someone high up was covering it all up. She needed help. She needed someone she could trust. And she knew exactly who to call. Detective Marcus Green was nursing a cup of bitter black coffee in his unlit office when his desk phone rang. He didn't get many calls this late. "Green," he answered. "Marcus, it's Lisa." His brow furrowed. "Lisa Brooks, the rookie officer." "This isn't a good time," he said, already feeling uneasy. "I know," Lisa said quickly. "But I found something. Something you need to see." Green sighed. "Lisa, if this is about that SEAL, it's bigger than him." Her voice was urgent. "Meet me at Jimmy's diner. 1 hour. Don't tell anyone." The line went dead. Green exhaled sharply and set down his cup. This was bad. And if Lisa Brooks, the straight-laced rookie, was reaching out like this, it meant things were worse than he thought. Back at the precinct, David had been moved to solitary confinement. No phone calls, no visitors, no outside contact. It was a classic move. Bury him before anyone could ask questions. But David was prepared. He had spent years enduring isolation training, learning how to break an enemy's mind in an interrogation room. And he knew one thing for sure. The longer they kept him in here, the more mistakes they would make. And he would be watching. Jimmy's diner was a 24-hour greasy spoon, off the highway. The kind of place where truckers and night owls gathered over bottomless coffee and stale pie. Lisa sat in the back booth, her knee bouncing under the table. A minute later, Green slid into the seat across from her, eyeing her with suspicion. "This better be good," he muttered. Lisa swallowed hard. "It's Myers, and Donovan, and probably Calloway too." Green's face hardened. "What did you find?" Lisa hesitated, then handed him a manila folder. Green flipped through it, his eyes scanning page after page of fabricated police reports, missing evidence logs, and a suspicious pattern of arrests, all linked to the same officers. His jaw clenched. "Son of a—" "There's more," Lisa interrupted, lowering her voice. "They've been targeting veterans, and every single one of them has been sent to the same holding facility before trial." Green frowned. "That's not normal." Lisa nodded. "Exactly. And get this, half of them never made it to trial at all." Green's grip on the folder tightened. He had suspected corruption for years. But this was a coordinated operation. And they had just stumbled into something much bigger than they realized. Inside the precinct, Lieutenant Calloway was sweating. The moment he received the memo about the Pentagon's intervention, he knew they were in trouble. He had spent years covering tracks, destroying evidence, and silencing whistleblowers. But now, the Pentagon and FBI were circling like sharks. He couldn't let this happen. Picking up his phone, he dialed a number he never wanted to call. When the voice on the other end answered, Calloway's voice was grim. "We have a problem." A deep chuckle. I heard, and I assume you're calling for a solution. Calloway's grip on the phone tightened. I need Williams gone. A pause. Consider it handled. The line went dead. Calloway exhaled, one problem down. Now he just had to pray it wouldn't come back to haunt him. The precinct was in chaos. Officers rushed through the halls, shouting commands, radios crackling with panicked voices. The attempted hit on David Williams had failed spectacularly, and now the entire department was scrambling to cover it up. Lieutenant Calloway stood in his office, watching the security footage in stunned silence. The 3 masked men he had sent to eliminate Williams were unconscious or worse, and Williams himself, barely a scratch. He clenched his jaw. This man was not just a soldier, he was a weapon. And if they didn't neutralize him soon, he would tear the whole system apart. Across the city, FBI agent Mike Harrison was sipping his morning coffee when his phone buzzed. We got a situation at the Atlanta PD. His interest piqued. Atlanta PD wasn't known for playing by the rules, and lately the number of complaints piling up against them had reached a breaking point. Harrison finished his coffee in one gulp, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. It was time to pay a visit. Back inside the precinct, David sat shackled to a metal chair in the dim interrogation room. Across from him, Detective Myers leaned against the table, smirking. You made quite a mess out there, Williams, Myers drawled. 3 men in the infirmary. Not bad for a guy in handcuffs. David remained silent. He knew the game, and he knew how to win it. You think you're tough? Myers continued, circling him like a vulture. You're nothing but another thug who got lucky. You don't have a badge. You don't have rights in here. You belong to us now. David chuckled. That right? Myers grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. You think this is funny? David locked eyes with him, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I was trained to resist torture, Myers. You think a few dirty cops scare me? For the first time, doubt flickered in Myers's eyes. David smirked. He had him. Lisa Brooks paced nervously outside the interrogation room, her hands clenched into fists. This is insane, she muttered. They're trying to bury him, Marcus, and we both know why. Detective Marcus Green exhaled slowly. I know, but this is bigger than just Myers and Calloway. If we move too soon, we'll get buried too. Lisa shoved a folder into his chest. Too late, she said. I already filed a report with Internal Affairs. If anything happens to Williams, everyone will know. Green's eyes widened. This just became a war. Back inside the precinct, Myers was losing control. The attempt on Williams's life had failed. Lisa Brooks was digging too deep. And now, the FBI was knocking at their door. He stormed into Calloway's office. We have to move him, Myers said. Tonight, before the feds get their hands on him. Calloway studied him. And where exactly do you propose we take him? I know a place, Myers said darkly. Off the books. No cameras, no records. Calloway nodded. Do it. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, David was dragged from his cell, wrists bound, a black hood over his head. They tossed him into the back of an unmarked van, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life. Destination? Unknown. But David Williams wasn't afraid, because he had one final trick up his sleeve. Tucked into his boot was a hidden blade, and by the time that van stopped moving, he would no longer be their prisoner. At the same time, FBI agent Mike Harrison arrived at the Atlanta PD precinct. Badge flashing, he stormed past the officers trying to stall him. I'm here for David Williams, he said. Where is he? Lieutenant Calloway forced a smile. I'm afraid you're too late, Agent Harrison. Harrison's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, too late? Calloway shrugged. Williams was transferred. To where? Calloway's smirk widened. Guess you'll have to find out. The van rattled over a dirt road, deep into the outskirts of Atlanta. David sat still, waiting. Then, he struck. With a quick flick of his wrist, the hidden blade sliced through his restraints. The two officers in the front never saw it coming. David lunged, wrapping the chain of his cuffs around the driver's throat. The van swerved violently, skidding off the road and slamming into a tree. The dust settled. David stumbled out, bruised but free. And now, he was coming for them. Lisa's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered hesitantly. Hello? A familiar voice crackled through the speaker. Officer Brooks. It's Williams. Lisa's heart nearly stopped. You're alive, she breathed. Where are you? David's voice was cold. That doesn't matter. What matters is this. You need to tell Harrison that Myers and Calloway tried to disappear me. This runs deep. I need to disappear on my own terms. Lisa swallowed hard. This is dangerous, David. If they know you're loose, they'll come after you even harder. David's voice didn't waver. Let them try. Click. The line went dead. FBI agent Harrison slammed his fist onto the precinct desk. You expect me to believe a federal suspect just vanished into thin air? He growled. Calloway smirked. Things happen. Harrison wasn't buying it. He turned to Lisa. You worked with Williams. Is there anything you're not telling me? Lisa hesitated. Then she made a decision. She leaned in and whispered, He's out there. And he's coming for them. Harrison's eyes widened. Then he smiled. This was about to get very interesting. Somewhere in the shadows of Atlanta, David Williams pulled a burner phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Caldwell? A pause. Then a deep voice. Williams. David's grip tightened around the phone. They tried to kill me. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate response. Then, let's return the favor. David nodded. The war had begun. The Atlanta PD had crossed the line. They had kidnapped a former Navy SEAL, tried to erase him, and now the entire system was crumbling under the weight of its corruption. David Williams had escaped, but he wasn't running. He was hunting, and he wasn't hunting alone. General Caldwell stood in the war room at the Pentagon, staring at the classified report on his desk. The Atlanta PD had lost control, and the FBI had been stonewalled at every turn. It was time to send a message. Caldwell picked up his secure line and dialed a number. Activate Shadow Team, he ordered. Silence. Then a response. Confirmed. Somewhere deep in Atlanta's abandoned industrial district, David Williams watched as the city moved beneath him. He had no backup, no weapons, and no official support. But what he did have was experience. Years of covert operations had taught him how to dismantle an enemy force from the inside out. Now, he just needed a way in. He picked up a burner phone and dialed a number. Lisa Brooks. She answered on the first ring. Williams. David's voice was calm. Too calm. I need you to get me inside the precinct. Lisa sucked in a breath. Are you insane? The whole department is on high alert. They'll kill you on sight. David smirked. Not if I kill them first. Silence. Then a resigned sigh. I'll handle the security feeds, but once you're in, you're on your own. David nodded. That's all I need. At FBI headquarters, Agent Mike Harrison sat across from Director Susan Patel, frustration evident on his face. You're telling me we're just letting this happen, he snapped. Patel exhaled slowly. This isn't just about Atlanta PD anymore. There are political players involved. Harrison clenched his fists. So what? We let them get away with it? Patel's expression hardened. Number, we build our case, and when the time is right, we take them down for good. Harrison stood. I hope you're right. Because if she wasn't, then David Williams would be the executioner instead. Midnight. The Atlanta PD precinct was locked down like a military base. But that wasn't going to stop David. With Lisa on the inside, he knew exactly where the blind spots were. Dressed in all black, he moved like a shadow, cutting through the perimeter in seconds. A guard never even saw him coming. One swift movement, lights out. David moved inside, his mind razor sharp. He had one goal: take down Myers. And he was so close. Inside the precinct, Lisa Brooks's heart pounded as she sat at the security desk. She had rerouted the cameras, shut down the silent alarms, and cleared a path for David. But then, a warning flashed on her screen. Emergency override detected. Lisa's blood ran cold. They knew. And now, David was walking into a trap. She grabbed her radio. Williams, it's a... Too late. The door burst open. David barely had time to react before bullets ripped through the room, forcing him to dive behind cover. Across from him, Detective Myers stood, gun raised, grinning. Did you really think you could walk in here and take me down? David smirked. Number, I thought I'd make you work for it. Then he moved. A flash of steel, a gunshot, a body hitting the ground. But it wasn't David's, it was Myers's partner. David stood over him, breathing hard, as Myers staggered back. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. David stepped forward. This ends tonight. Just as Myers reached for his weapon, boom! The front doors exploded inward, and through the smoke, Shadow Team entered. A Black Ops SEAL unit moving with deadly precision. The precinct erupted into chaos. Cops scrambled, guns drawn. But they were outmatched. This wasn't a fight. This was an extermination. And in the middle of it, David Williams, moving like the ghost of war himself. With Myers in custody, David and Shadow Team disappeared into the night. Atlanta PD was finished. But the fight, far from over. Because Myers wasn't the top of the food chain. And the people who were, they were watching, waiting, preparing. But David had a message for them. He picked up the radio from Myers's vest, held it to his mouth, and spoke 3 chilling words. I'm coming next. David Williams had won a battle. But the war was far from over. Myers was in custody. The precinct was in ruins. Yet, beneath the surface, a network of corruption was still thriving. And David, he wasn't stopping until he burned it all to the ground. The morning after the raid, Atlanta woke up to a new reality. Breaking news covered the spectacular downfall of the police department. The footage was everywhere. A SWAT unit storming the precinct, corrupt cops, surrendering in fear. Detective Myers in cuffs, his face bloodied. The entire city was talking. I heard a former Navy SEAL took down half the department. The Pentagon got involved? That's insane. Inside City Hall, Mayor Dawson watched the news in horror. This is a disaster, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He turned to his advisor. Tell me we can contain this. The advisor shook his head. Sir, it's already out of control. Lisa Brooks sat at her desk, hands trembling. She had just made the biggest decision of her life. In front of her was a USB drive, filled with classified police records. It had everything. Evidence of wrongful arrests, bribes between cops and local gangs, illegal asset seizures, and worst of all, direct connections between Myers and Mayor Dawson. She took a deep breath. And then, she sent everything to investigative journalist Sarah Lawson. The moment she hit send, her phone rang. Blocked number. Lisa hesitated, then answered. You just signed your own death warrant. A deep voice growled. Click. Lisa froze. Someone knew. She wasn't safe anymore. At the Atlanta Times, Sarah Lawson received the email. The moment she opened the files, she gasped. This is massive. She called her editor. Jason, we need to run this story. Now. But Jason hesitated. Sarah, if this is real, you understand what's going to happen, right? Sarah clenched her fists. I don't care. The people deserve to know. Jason sighed. Then God help us all. David Williams had vanished. No one knew where he was. But those who needed to find him, they knew where to look. At a remote safe house, David sat across from FBI agent Mike Harrison. Tell me, Harrison, how deep does this go? Harrison slid a folder across the table. David opened it, and his jaw tightened. Mayor Dawson took millions in dirty money. Chief of Police Reynolds ordered cover-ups for corrupt officers. State Senator Carter protected the entire operation from Washington. David exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Myers. This was systemic. Harrison met his gaze. You still in this fight, Williams? David closed the folder. I was born in this fight. Inside a maximum security holding cell, Myers sat in a metal chair, hands cuffed behind his back. Across from him, Agent Harrison leaned forward. You're done, Myers. You know that, right? Myers scoffed. You think you're the first guy who's tried to take me down? Harrison smirked. Number, but I'll be the last. Then he pulled out a photo, a picture of Mayor Dawson and Myers shaking hands. Myers' smirks vanished. Harrison leaned in. We already have Brooks' testimony. We have the files. We have the FBI, the Pentagon, and half the damn country watching. You can go down. Alone. Harrison paused. Or you can help us take down the real monsters. For the first time, Myers looked afraid. And then he nodded. All right, so I'll talk. 2 days later, breaking news. Atlanta's mayor, police chief, and state senator exposed in massive corruption scandal. Sarah Lawson's article went viral. Millions of dollars in bribes, dozens of wrongful arrests, judges, politicians, and gang leaders involved. The city erupted. Thousands took to the streets, demanding justice. Protesters surrounded City Hall, chanting David's name. The President of the United States issued a formal statement. This is a failure of our justice system, and we will hold every guilty party accountable. Mayor Dawson went into hiding. The governor of Georgia called for an emergency session. And David, he was just getting started. That night, inside an undisclosed government facility, Lisa Brooks sat alone. She was under federal protection, but her nerves were shot. Then, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. You made a mistake. Lisa's heart pounded. Another message came through. Unknown number. You think you won. A final message. Unknown number. We're not done yet. Lisa's screen glitched, then went black. She wasn't just being watched. She was being hunted. Atlanta was on fire, not from flames, but from rage. The streets were flooded with people. Protesters chanting for justice, banners waving, justice for David. Police barricades failing to hold back the crowds. David Williams' story had become a movement. And the city? It was about to reach its boiling point. At City Hall, Mayor Dawson sat behind his desk, face pale. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Governor calling lawyers, calling FBI calling. He ignored them all. Then, his chief of staff rushed in, panic in his eyes. Sir, we have a problem. Dawson slammed his fist on the table. I know. No, sir. Not just the protests. The man handed Dawson a file. Evidence linking him to police corruption, bank records showing illegal money transfers, wiretaps from Myers' confession. Dawson's hands shook. "Who has this?" The chief of staff swallowed hard. "Everyone, sir." That night, downtown Atlanta turned into a battlefield. Police in riot gear, protesters breaking through barriers, reporters capturing every second. Sarah Lawson stood in the crowd, microphone in hand. The people of Atlanta are making their voices heard. They want justice. They want accountability. But then, boom! A tear gas canister exploded. People screamed. Chaos broke loose. David watched from the rooftops. He clenched his fists. "This isn't just about me anymore," he whispered. "This is about all of them." Inside a high-security prison, Myers sat in his cell, eyes darting to the door. He wasn't going down alone. That's when his lawyer arrived. "You have one shot at getting out of this," the lawyer whispered. Myers leaned in. "You'll be transferred tonight. The warden is on our payroll. A car will be waiting." Myers smirked. "Good, because I've got unfinished business." Agent Mike Harrison sat in an FBI war room, staring at a map of Atlanta. "Mayor Dawson is next," he said. But his partner shook his head. "Dawson is desperate. If we don't move fast, he'll disappear." That's when Lisa Brooks entered. She threw a USB drive on the table. "Then we don't wait. We take him down now." Mayor Dawson wasn't going down without a fight. He picked up the phone, dialed a number. A deep voice answered. "You better have a good reason for calling." Dawson swallowed hard. "I need protection." The voice laughed coldly. "You're not worth protecting anymore." Dawson's blood ran cold. He had just been cut loose. And now? He was on his own. That night, a black SUV pulled up outside a private airport. Inside, Myers. He smirked, stepping out, thinking he was home free. But then, FBI, hands in the air. Spotlights blinded him. Myers froze. "Shh." Lisa Brooks stepped forward, gun drawn. "Going somewhere?" Myers turned to run, but agents tackled him to the ground. Game over. At the Pentagon, General Caldwell sat at a massive table, facing the Secretary of Defense. "We've let this go on long enough," Caldwell growled. The Secretary nodded. "Then let's end it." Order signed. The Atlanta Police Department, officially disbanded. A full federal takeover begins at dawn. The next morning, David stood on the steps of the courthouse. A crowd gathered, cameras rolling. He took a deep breath. Then he spoke. "This fight wasn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been wrongfully arrested, beaten, and silenced." The crowd roared. David clenched his fists. "And I promise you, we're not done yet." Washington, D.C. The air inside the Pentagon's war room was thick with tension. General Caldwell stood at the head of it, military and intelligence officials. The overhead lights cast sharp shadows across his face, making him look even more imposing than usual. The video played on the screen, footage of David Williams being brutalized by the Atlanta police. The room was silent, except for the sound of the recording. The officers shouting, the sickening thud of fists against flesh, the voice of a bystander screaming, "He's a veteran." And then, the moment the Pentagon had been waiting for, Myers, on a recorded phone call, laughing about how he taught that boy a lesson. Caldwell's jaw clenched. "The entire Atlanta Police Department is compromised," he said, voice hard as steel. The Secretary of Defense nodded grimly. "Then, it's time we take over." With a swift motion, he signed the order. Effective immediately. The Atlanta Police Department is to be placed under full federal control. All officers involved in corruption are to be detained. A military task force is being deployed to enforce the takeover. Caldwell exhaled. "This is going to get ugly." Atlanta, 5 a.m. The sky was still dark when the first convoy of armored vehicles rolled into the city. SWAT teams in riot gear, black helicopters hovering above police precincts, federal agents taking positions at every major intersection. The Atlanta PD never saw it coming. Inside Precinct 14, Captain Reynolds was sipping his morning coffee when his radio crackled. "Sir, we've got feds everywhere." Reynolds stood so fast his chair toppled over. "What the hell do you mean, everywhere?" The officer's voice came back, panicked. "They're shutting us down." And then, boom! The front doors of the precinct burst open as a team of heavily armed U.S. Marshals stormed in. Everyone on the ground. Reynolds' coffee cup shattered on the floor. Myers, still in handcuffs from his failed escape attempt, watched from a holding cell and smirked. "Looks like the cavalry's here." Somewhere in the basement of the FBI safe house, David Williams was sitting in a steel chair, wrists still bruised from the handcuffs. Lisa Brooks entered the room, looking exhausted but relieved. "You're free," she said, tossing a manila folder onto the table. David didn't move. "Say that again?" She gave a small smile. "You're free, David. The charges are dropped. The Pentagon shut down the entire department. You can go home." But David's face hardened. "Home?" he echoed. He shook his head. "Not until we finish this." Meanwhile, Mayor Dawson was in full damage control mode. His office was in chaos, phones ringing, aides running back and forth. His chief of staff burst in. "Sir, the DOJ is demanding you resign." Dawson's face turned red. "Over my dead body." The aide swallowed. "Sir, that might be the only way this ends for you." And then, his office door burst open. FBI agents swarmed in. Dawson, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." The entire room froze. Dawson paled. "This is a mistake," he stammered. The lead agent smirked. "Yeah? Tell it to the judge." Click. Handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. And just like that, the most powerful man in Atlanta fell. By nightfall, Atlanta's streets were alive with celebration. People cheering reporters, broadcasting the historic moment, chants of "Justice for David" ringing through the air. David stood in the center of it all, staring at the city that had once turned its back on him. Lisa stepped beside him. "It's over, David." But he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." David's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice spoke. "Mr. Williams, you think you won." David froze. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "The Pentagon took down Atlanta PD, but they missed something." David's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Silence. Then, "The corruption goes deeper than you think." Click. Call ended. David stared at his phone. Lisa frowned. "What is it?" He exhaled slowly. "We're not done yet." The night air in Atlanta was electric. The city had erupted into protests and celebrations, a chaotic blend of anger, relief, and anticipation. Anger, for the years of unchecked brutality. Relief, that corrupt officers were finally facing justice. Anticipation, for what would happen next. David Williams stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, his bruised face illuminated by the flash of cameras. Reporters shouted questions, microphones shoved forward. But he wasn't ready to speak. Instead, he watched as federal agents escorted Myers and dozens of corrupt officers into armored vans. The entire Atlanta Police Department had been dismantled. And yet, David knew, this fight was far from over. Because the real power players had yet to be exposed. FBI headquarters, 6:45 a.m. Myers sat handcuffed to a steel table. His once smug face was drained of color, sweat glistening on his forehead. Across from him, FBI Special Agent Mike Harrison leaned back in his chair, watching Myers like a predator studying its prey. "You know why you're here," Harrison said. Myers scoffed, forcing bravado. "Yeah? What's the charge this time?" Harrison smirked. "Where should I start? Kidnapping, assault, fraud, tampering with evidence, federal obstruction, RICO violations." Myers flinched, and then Harrison slid a folder across the table. Inside, dozens of documents linking Myers to higher-ups in City Hall, private security firms, and even political figures. "You were never the big fish, Myers," Harrison said, voice cold. "You were just a cog in a much bigger machine." Myers swallowed. "You think I'm gonna talk?" Harrison grinned. "Oh, you'll talk," he said, and he pulled out his trump card. A USB drive. Plugged it into the laptop. A video played. It was Myers, caught on a wiretap, bragging. "The mayor's got my back. Hell, the governor too. We run this damn city." Myers' face turned white. Harrison leaned forward. "Your only chance at walking out of here is giving us names." Myers clenched his jaw. And then he broke. Across town, Lisa Brooks sat in an unmarked car, listening through her earpiece. She could hear Myers talking, spilling every name he knew. But then, something changed. Myers gave a name no one expected. Lisa's blood ran cold, because he didn't just name city officials. He named someone inside the FBI. Lisa barely had time to process the information before gunshots rang out. She ducked instinctively, her windshield shattering. A black SUV peeled away from the scene. Lisa gasped, clutching her radio. "Agent down! Agent down!" And then, a fireball erupted from the building behind her. The safe house holding Myers had just exploded. Back at the federal safe house, David was sitting across from General Caldwell. "Someone just silenced Myers," Caldwell said grimly. David exhaled slowly. "They knew he was going to talk." Caldwell nodded. "And whoever they are, they're bigger than we thought." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, David stood up. "Then we go after them next." Caldwell smirked. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The city was on edge. An FBI informant had just been assassinated. A federal safe house had been bombed. And somewhere in Atlanta, a rogue force was still pulling the strings. David Williams knew one thing for certain. Whoever they were, they wouldn't go down without a fight. And neither would he. 11 p.m. Safe house, downtown Atlanta. David sat across from General Caldwell, Special Agent Harrison, and Lisa Brooks. A large digital screen in front of them showed maps of the city, red circles marking locations of known corruption ties. Lisa's voice was sharp. "We lost Myers, but we still have his files. He gave us just enough to find out who's really in charge." She clicked a button. A face appeared on the screen. Mayor James Dawson. David wasn't surprised. Caldwell crossed his arms. "We always knew Dawson was dirty. But if Myers named him as part of this operation, that means it goes higher." Lisa nodded. "It does. We just got a hit from NSA surveillance. Dawson's meeting with someone tonight. A major backer of the city's private security firms. The same ones replacing the Atlanta PD." David leaned forward. "Where?" Lisa hesitated. Then she clicked again. A new location appeared on the map. The Bradford Grand Hotel. 2:30 a.m. Bradford Grand Hotel. Penthouse suite. Dawson sat in a leather chair, swirling whiskey in a glass. Across from him, a man in a tailored suit was checking his watch impatiently. "We need to move fast," the man said. Dawson took a slow sip. "We don't move until I say we move." The man clenched his jaw. "If we don't silence Williams and that FBI agent, we're all dead men." He reached into his jacket before he could pull out his gun. The door exploded inward. FBI and military teams stormed the room. David was the first through the smoke. Dawson reached for a weapon, but David's fist met his jaw before he had the chance. Lisa tackled the man in the suit, slamming him against the wall. Outside, black SUVs screeched to a halt, but FBI snipers were already in position. In under a minute, it was over. Dawson was cuffed. The man in the suit was unmasked, a high-ranking Pentagon official. Caldwell stared at him in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." 5:45 a.m. FBI black site. Dawson sat in an interrogation room, his face bloody, his shirt torn. Across from him, David stood silently. Dawson sneered, "You think arresting me changes anything? You have no idea how deep this goes." David didn't blink. "You're right, but you're going to tell me anyway." Dawson laughed. "And why would I do that?" David reached into his pocket, pulled out a small recording device. A file played. Dawson's own voice, recorded from the Bradford Grand Hotel. "We don't move until I say we move." Dawson's face went pale. David leaned in. "You're done. The only question is whether you go down alone or take the others with you." Silence. Then Dawson exhaled and started talking. Meanwhile, Lisa was monitoring the wiretap feeds. Dawson was giving them everything: names, dates, locations. But then something new came up. Dawson hadn't been the one giving orders. He was following orders. And the real leader. Lisa's stomach dropped. She grabbed her radio. "David, get in here. Now." David rushed in. Lisa turned the screen towards him and highlighted a name in red. David's eyes went wide, because the real man behind everything was someone David knew, someone he once trusted. The weight of the past can be crushing. For David Williams, redemption was never about erasing the scars. It was about making sure no one else had to bear them. And now, as he stood before the most powerful lawmakers in the country, he realized this was the battle he had been fighting his entire life. Washington, D.C. U.S. Capitol Building. The Senate chamber was packed. Media cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. The entire country was watching. At the center of it all, David Williams. Seated across from him were senators, military officials, and federal investigators. A ranking senator, Senator Elizabeth Carter, leaned forward. "Mr. Williams, you have become a symbol of everything that's wrong with our justice system." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "And yet, you still chose to fight within the system instead of burning it down. Tell me." Her eyes locked onto his. "Why?" The room fell silent. David took a slow breath. Then he spoke. "I fought for this country not because it was perfect, but because I believed in what it could be." He scanned the faces in the room. "I grew up being told that justice was blind, that wearing a uniform meant something, that my service meant something." He shook his head. "But on a rainy night in Atlanta, none of that mattered. My medals didn't matter. My sacrifices didn't matter." His voice hardened. "I was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time." Silence. Then he leaned in. "But you know what? That night didn't break me." He looked directly at Senator Carter. "You ask me why I didn't burn it all down. Because people like Lisa Brooks still exist. Because men like General Caldwell still fight. Because families across this country still pray that justice means something." His jaw tightened. "And because if we let corruption win, then everything I fought for, everything my brothers and sisters in uniform died for, was for nothing." The silence was deafening. Then, applause. Some senators nodded, others whispered. But the nation had heard him. As David left the chamber, he felt a presence behind him. A man in a gray suit walked up, speaking in a hushed tone. "Mr. Williams, we need to talk." David stopped. The man flashed a CIA badge. David's instincts went on high alert. The agent leaned in. "We have intelligence suggesting that your testimony put you on someone's kill list." David didn't flinch. "Who?" The agent's eyes darkened. "The people who were really running Atlanta PD." David exhaled. "Then, let them come." Atlanta, police headquarters. Meanwhile, Lisa Brooks was being watched. She had been promoted to interim police chief, but not everyone was happy about it. As she walked toward her car, a shadow moved behind her. A gloved hand reached for a silencer. But before the trigger could be pulled, a shot rang out. Lisa spun. Her attacker collapsed, and in the distance, a black SUV peeled away. Lisa knew. Someone wanted her dead, and they weren't finished yet. Washington, D.C. Hotel suite. That night, David was alone in his hotel room, staring out at the Capitol. His phone buzzed. "Lisa." "David, they came after me." David stiffened. "I barely made it out. Someone inside the force wants us both gone." David exhaled. "Then we finish this now." Suddenly, the door burst open. Black-clad assassins stormed the room. David reacted instantly. He flipped the nightstand over. Bullets tore through the wood. Dove for cover, grabbed his sidearm, fired 3 quick shots. 2 assailants went down. One man lunged with a knife. David caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into the glass table. But outside, more were coming. David grabbed his phone. "Lisa, I need an exit, now." She was already moving. "Hang on, I'm sending backup." David wasn't planning on waiting. He grabbed a fire extinguisher, blasted it at the remaining attackers, creating a cloud of white. Dove through the shattered window, landed on the balcony below. By the time backup arrived, the assassins were gone. But the message was clear. Someone wanted David Williams erased, and he had just run out of time. The Pentagon, Secure Conference Room General Caldwell was livid. "They tried to kill a witness in a federal case." Lisa shook her head. "They tried to kill 2. The CIA agent from earlier stood. "This isn't over. The people who gave the orders are still out there." David, bruised but unbroken, leaned forward. "Then we go after them." Caldwell exhaled. "David, these aren't just dirty cops. They're tied to people in high places. Some of them still have power." David's jaw tightened. "Then we take their power away." Lisa crossed her arms. "You're talking about a full-scale takedown." David nodded. "I am." The CIA agent looked between them. Then he slid a classified file across the table. David opened it and froze, because the first name on the list was someone he never expected. The Pentagon, classified briefing room. David Williams sat across from General Caldwell, Lisa Brooks, and a team of high-ranking federal officials. The room buzzed with tension. A large screen flickered on, revealing names, locations, and classified reports. At the top of the list, Senator Richard Dalton, a man who had built his entire career preaching law and order. A man who, behind the scenes, had been pulling the strings of a corrupt system for decades. David's fist clenched. "So, this is who ordered my execution." The CIA agent from before nodded. "Dalton is just the tip of the iceberg. The network goes deeper. Judges, police chiefs, even members of federal law enforcement. We're talking about a shadow system that's been protecting dirty cops for years." General Caldwell's voice was grim. "If we take this fight to them, we have to be ready for war." David exhaled. "Then let's end this war." Atlanta, Georgia, police headquarters. Lisa Brooks walked into her new office, now officially chief of police, a title that should have meant power. But right now, it felt like a target on her back. Her phone buzzed. "David, we've got a list of names, people inside your department who are still loyal to the old guard." Lisa's stomach tightened. "How bad is it?" "Bad. Some of them are in your top brass." Lisa ran a hand through her hair. "I'll handle my department. You take care of Washington." "Be careful, Lisa. Always." But as she hung up, she noticed a red laser dot moving across her desk. A sniper. Lisa dove for cover, just as the bullet shattered her office window. She reached for her sidearm, heart pounding. Somebody didn't want her cleaning house. But they had just made a mistake, because she wasn't backing down. Washington, D.C. Federal Courthouse. David walked into the courthouse flanked by U.S. Marshals. Inside, a grand jury had been assembled. Their job? To hear the evidence, to take down everyone involved. And that started with Senator Richard Dalton. As David took his seat, the courtroom doors opened, and in walked Dalton himself, flanked by his lawyers, smug, untouchable. Or so he thought. But David was ready, because in his hands was a file that could destroy Dalton's entire career, and he was about to drop a bombshell. Dalton's attorney smirked. "Mr. Williams, do you have any proof that my client was involved in police corruption?" David slid a document across the table, a bank record, tracing millions of dollars from Dalton's personal accounts to offshore shell companies, companies linked directly to dirty cops. Dalton's smirk vanished. David wasn't done. "You built a system designed to protect bad cops. You funded departments that covered up murders. You paid off politicians to keep your network alive." David leaned in. "And when that system failed to keep me quiet, you ordered my assassination." Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Dalton's lawyers scrambled to respond. But David had one more card to play. A recorded phone call between Dalton and Myers, the corrupt police officer now sitting in federal custody. Dalton's voice, loud and clear. "Williams doesn't make it to that hearing. Do you understand?" Dalton's face turned pale. He knew it was over. The judge banged the gavel. "Senator Richard Dalton, you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder." The system that had protected him for decades was finally crumbling. And David Williams? He was just getting started. Atlanta Police Department Lisa Brooks was done playing defense. She stormed into the briefing room, where the department's senior officers sat. She tossed a thick folder onto the table. "These are the names of every officer under federal investigation." Silence. Some of them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked furious. Lisa's voice was steel. "If your name is on that list, you have 24 hours to turn in your badge, or I'll have you arrested myself." A senior officer scoffed. "You think you can clean up Atlanta PD all by yourself?" Lisa didn't flinch. "Number, but I don't have to." Behind her, the doors opened. Federal agents walked in. David had sent backup, and within minutes, Atlanta PD was purged. The White House, Oval Office. David and Lisa sat across from the President of the United States. On the desk, a bill, one that would reform policing nationwide. The President looked at David. "You've done something historic here." David shook his head. "We did it." And with that, the President signed the bill into law, and the corrupt system that once destroyed lives was officially dead. United States Federal Courthouse, Washington, D.C. The day had come. The trial that would decide the fate of an entire system. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, lawmakers. All eyes were on Richard Dalton, the former senator turned criminal defendant. And at the heart of it all, Fire David Williams, the man who had survived corruption, brutality, and an assassination attempt, just to bring justice. Dalton sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. He still had connections, still had money. But for the first time in his life, he had lost control. The prosecution wasted no time. A parade of witnesses took the stand. Lisa Brooks, now Atlanta's chief of police, testifying about the systemic corruption she uncovered. FBI agent Mike Harrison, detailing how Dalton funneled millions into illegal police operations. Journalist Sarah Lawson, presenting a smoking gun, leaked documents proving Dalton orchestrated the cover-up of police brutality cases. Dalton's lawyers fought back. "This is a political hit job," one attorney thundered. But then, David took the stand. The courtroom fell silent. Dalton's lawyers smirked. "Mr. Williams, you claim my client is guilty of corruption. Do you have direct evidence that he was personally involved?" David reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. Evidence file. Operation Blackout. A file containing leaked audio recordings, bank transactions, and internal memos, all linking Dalton to decades of illegal activity. A file that no lawyer could spin. Dalton's smirk vanished. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Williams, would you care to explain what we're about to hear?" David's voice was steady. "This is the truth they tried to bury." Courtroom audio playback. Dalton's voice clear as day. "I don't care what it takes. Williams doesn't make it to that hearing." Gasps erupted in the courtroom. The assassination order, coming directly from Dalton's mouth. Dalton's lawyers panicked. "Objection. That recording is—" The judge cut them off. "Overruled. Let it play." Dalton's voice continued. "We control the police, the judges. If Williams dies, this all disappears." David met Dalton's gaze. "Well, I'm still here." And just like that, the case was over. The judge turned to the jury. "The evidence is irrefutable. Mr. Dalton, you have been found guilty on all charges." Dalton slumped in his chair. The weight of decades of corruption crushing him. Sentenced to life without parole. Justice finally served. Atlanta, Georgia. Police Academy graduation ceremony. Months had passed. Lisa Brooks stood before a new generation of officers. No more corruption. No more brutality. Just justice. As she handed out badges, she saw something in their eyes. Hope. David's nonprofit. New Beginnings Foundation. David didn't return to the military. Didn't go into politics. Instead, he built something new. A foundation dedicated to helping veterans, fighting wrongful convictions, and holding corrupt institutions accountable. Lisa walked into his office. "You really built all this?" she asked. David smiled. "One fight at a time." She handed him an envelope, an official declaration from Congress. David read the words and froze. They were naming a new law after him. A law ensuring police accountability. A law that would change the country forever. David swallowed hard. "It's not about me," he said. Lisa nodded. "Number, but you made it possible." And with that, the system that once tried to bury him had now carved his name into history. United States Capitol, Washington, D.C. The chamber was silent. Hundreds of lawmakers, journalists, and citizens sat in the grand hall of the United States Senate. On the podium stood a man who had survived everything. Brutality, corruption, assassination attempts, fire David Williams. And today, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every innocent person who had ever been silenced. David stepped forward. The Williams Act was displayed on a massive screen behind him. The bill that would reform policing across America. The bill that would end qualified immunity, mandate federal oversight, and ensure justice for victims of police brutality. David took a breath, and he spoke. I never asked to be a symbol. But when they threw me on the ground that night, when they put their knees on my back, they didn't just attack me. They attacked everything this country stands for. Murmurs filled the room. He continued, his voice steady, powerful. For too long, people like me have been told to move on, to forget. But how can you forget when the system is designed to break you? Silence. Absolute silence. Then, applause. A standing ovation. One by one, lawmakers from both parties stood in support. Lisa Brooks, now Atlanta's chief of police, watched from the front row. Tears in her eyes. David had done it. The bill was heading to the president's desk. History was being made. Atlanta, Georgia. 1 year later, gone were the corrupt officials. Gone were the police stations run like criminal enterprises. In their place, a new generation of officers. Lisa Brooks, the first black female chief of police in Atlanta's history. Marcus Green, the detective who had secretly fought corruption, now head of internal affairs. Sarah Lawson, the journalist who exposed it all, now leading a national task force on police accountability. Atlanta wasn't just different, it was better. And David? He had one final mission. New Beginnings Foundation, David's nonprofit. David never stopped fighting. His foundation worked to checkmark free wrongfully convicted prisoners, provide legal aid to veterans, expose corruption before it could spread. One afternoon, Lisa walked into his office. She held a folder. Another case? David asked, smirking. Lisa nodded. An old police case, one that had been buried for decades. The system's better, she said. But we're not done yet. David smiled. Then let's get to work. National Mall, Washington, D.C. A statue was being unveiled. A bronze figure standing tall, looking toward the horizon. A tribute to every victim who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. Lisa, Sarah, and Marcus stood beside David as the cloth was pulled away. And there, carved into the stone, justice isn't given, it is demanded. David Williams. A new generation of activists, officers, and lawmakers stood in awe. They weren't just witnessing history, they were becoming part of it. David looked out at the world he had helped change, and he knew. The fight for justice never truly ends. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting alone. David's story may have ended, but the fight for justice never stops. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Do you think the system can ever truly change? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it. And if this story made you think, made you feel, or even made you a little angry, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, the next story, it's one you won't want to miss. On Fire.